Imagine holding a Bible that most Christians have never seen. Not a translation error, not a lost manuscript, a complete Bible older, larger, and more mysterious than the one sitting on most church shelves today. Now imagine being told that this Bible was dangerous, that it carried books the world was not ready to read, that its contents challenged the authority of empires, councils, and traditions. This is the story of why the Ethiopian Bible was banned, sidelined, and quietly erased from mainstream Christianity, and why it survived anyway. To understand this story, we must begin by destroying a popular myth. The Ethiopian Bible was not recently discovered. It was not hidden in a cave, and it was not created in rebellion against Christianity. It has been read continuously for over 1,600 years. While Europe was still debating doctrine, Ethiopia was already guarding a version of Scripture that predates many of the theological decisions shaping modern Christianity today, and that alone makes people uncomfortable. At the center of this mystery is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 4th century, making it one of the first nations on earth to officially adopt the faith. Long before Christianity became dominant in Europe, but Ethiopia did not simply receive Christianity. It preserved it. While Rome standardized doctrine, Ethiopia protected ancient texts. While Europe translated Scripture repeatedly, Ethiopia guarded its canon in Ge'ez, a sacred classical language no longer spoken conversationally, but fiercely protected in liturgy and Scripture. And here is where the tension begins. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books, not 66, not 73.80-1. Books that many Christians have never heard of, books that disappeared from Western Bibles, books that were labeled apocryphal, non-canonical, or heretical, yet Ethiopia now removed them. The most controversial among them is the Book of Enoch, a text quoted directly in the New Testament, referenced by early church fathers, and deeply influential in early Jewish and Christian theology, and yet it vanished from most Christian Bibles. Why? This question has haunted scholars, theologians, and believers for centuries, because banning a book is never just about theology, it is about authority. As Christianity spread across the Roman Empire, belief had to be controlled. Disagreements were dangerous. Competing interpretations threatened unity, and unity was essential for empire. That is why in the 4th century, church leaders convened powerful councils, the most famous being the Council of Nicaea. These councils were not casual Bible studies. They were political and theological battlegrounds, often backed by imperial power. Their mission was simple: decide what Christianity is and what it is not. Texts were debated, doctrines were defined, and slowly, a standard canon emerged. But Ethiopia was different, geographically isolated, culturally distinct, and spiritually independent. Ethiopia was not under Roman ecclesiastical control. While Europe standardized Scripture through councils and later through institutions like the Roman Catholic Church, Ethiopia followed a tradition rooted in ancient Jewish Christian theology. This meant Ethiopia kept texts others abandoned, not because they were ignorant, but because they believed those texts were authentic. This difference created a quiet but growing divide. As Christianity evolved in Europe, especially after the Protestant Reformation, new translations, like the King James Bible, further solidified a shorter canon. Anything outside that structure became suspicious. Over time, the Ethiopian Bible was no longer treated as different, it was treated as wrong. Western scholars dismissed it. Missionaries ignored it. Colonial narratives framed Ethiopia as ancient, but theologically incomplete. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Fragments of books like Enoch were later found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, confirming their ancient Jewish origins. The very texts once dismissed as unreliable were proven to be older than many accepted scriptures, and yet the Western canon did not change, because removing a book is easy. Admitting you removed it for the wrong reasons is not. So was the Ethiopian Bible banned, not in one dramatic moment, Not by a single decree. It was banned by silence, by exclusion, by redefining canon so narrowly that Ethiopia's scriptures no longer fit, and still Ethiopia has surrendered its Bible. For centuries, monks copied these texts by hand. Churches read them aloud. Traditions preserve them orally and liturgically. Even when colonial powers arrived, the Ethiopian canon remained untouched. That survival is not accidental. It is intentional resistance, and it raises an unsettling question. What if Christianity once had multiple legitimate canons? What if some truths were lost not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? This is not just a story about ancient books. It is a story about who gets to decide truth, who controls scripture, and who history listens to. In the next section, we will go deeper, examining what exactly is inside the Ethiopian Bible, how its canon differs from Western Bibles, and why certain books were especially threatening to centralized religious authority. Because once you see what was removed, you begin to understand why. And that is where this story truly begins. If the Ethiopian Bible had simply contained a few extra hymns or historical footnotes, it would never have caused controversy. The problem was never the number of books. The problem was the content. To understand why the Ethiopian Bible was sidelined, we must look closely at what it actually contains and how those texts reshape the way early Christianity, angels, sign, judgment, and divine authority are understood. The Ethiopian Bible consists of 81 books, divided into what scholars often describe as a narrow canon and a broader canon. The narrow canon resembles what many Christians recognize today: the Torah, historical books, wisdom literature, prophets, the Gospels, Acts, and epistles. But the broader canon is where everything changes. These additional books are not random additions. They represent older streams of Jewish and early Christian thought that existed long before Christianity was centralized under Imperial Rome. Among the most controversial is the Book of Enoch, preserved in its most complete form only within the Ethiopian tradition. This text does something extraordinary. It expands the biblical worldview beyond simple human morality into a cosmic narrative involving angels, rebellion, forbidden knowledge, and divine judgment. Enoch introduces the Watchers, angelic beings tasked with observing humanity, who instead descend to earth, corrupt mankind, and teach forbidden arts. This story reframes evil not merely as human weakness, but as cosmic contamination. That idea alone was destabilizing, because once evil is cosmic, authority must be cosmic too. The Book of Enoch also introduces detailed descriptions of heaven, judgment, and the Messiah centuries before the New Testament was written. It even refers to a Son of Man figure who executes divine judgment, a title later used by Jesus himself. This raises an uncomfortable question. If early Christians knew and read Enoch and evidence suggests many did, why was it removed? The answer lies in control. Texts like Enoch challenged the simplified moral frameworks later preferred by centralized churches. They suggested a universe where divine beings operate independently of institutional authority, where knowledge itself could be dangerous, and where God's judgment extended beyond human systems. And Enoch was only the beginning. The Ethiopian canon also includes Jubilees, a book that reorganizes biblical history into cycles of divine time, emphasizing covenant, law, and cosmic order. Jubilee strengthens Jewish Christian continuity, reinforcing Sabbath observance and angelic mediation. For Western theology, this posed a problem. Christianity in Europe increasingly distanced itself from its Jewish roots. Jubilees refused that separation. It insisted that Christianity was not a replacement, but a continuation. Then, there is 1-3 Maccabean, often confused with the Greek Maccabees, but entirely different texts. These books focus less on military revolt and more on spiritual resistance, loyalty to God over empire, and divine justice against corrupt rulers. That message was deeply threatening. A Bible that teaches resistance to ungodly power is dangerous in the hands of empires. But perhaps the most overlooked issue is how these books decentralize religious authority. In many Ethiopian texts, revelation is not limited to councils, popes, or institutions. God speaks through visions, angels, prophets, and righteous individuals, often outside formal structures. That idea directly undermines centralized ecclesiastical power. Contrast this with post-4th century Western Christianity, where doctrine increasingly flowed from councils, like the Council of Nicaea, and later from institutional authorities such as the Roman Catholic Church. Uniform belief required uniform texts. Anything that complicated theology or empowered believers independently had to go. Over time, labels were introduced: apocrypha, pseudepigrapha, non-canonical. These terms sound academic, but they functioned as gatekeeping tools. Once a book was labeled non-canonical, it no longer mattered how ancient or influential it was. It was excluded from worship, translation, and education. And slowly, it disappeared. Except in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church ever accepted Rome's authority to define Scripture. Its canon was already established through tradition, liturgy, and usage, not imperial endorsement. This difference reveals something critical. Canon was not decided once. It was negotiated over centuries. Western Christianity presents its Bible as inevitable and universal. Ethiopian Christianity quietly exposes that narrative as incomplete, because when scholars later discovered fragments of Enoch and Jubilees among the Dead Sea Scrolls, it confirmed what Ethiopia had always claimed. These books were not late inventions. They were ancient. Their removal was theological, not historical. So why didn't the Western Church restore them? Because restoring them would reopen questions no institution once asked. Questions like, who decides what God said? Can truth exist outside councils? Was early Christianity more diverse than we were taught? These questions destabilize authority. An authority, once consolidated, resists disruption. This is why the Ethiopian Bible was not banned by decree, or publicly condemned. That would draw attention. Instead, it was marginalized, ignored in seminaries, excluded from translations, dismissed as regional. Yet today, as digital access exposes ancient texts, the Ethiopian Bible resurfacing not as a curiosity, but as a challenge to the idea that Christianity has only one legitimate story. In the next section, we will confront the most sensitive part of this history: how power, empire, and colonial influence shaped which Bibles the world was allowed to read, and how Africa's spiritual authority was deliberately minimized. Because this story is not only theological. It is political. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. By now, one truth should be clear. The story of the Ethiopian Bible is not only about theology, it is about power. Because sacred texts do not exist in a vacuum. They are preserved, translated, copied, and promoted by people, and people are shaped by politics, empires, and control. Once Christianity moved from persecuted faith to imperial religion, Scripture itself became a political instrument. And that is when the fate of the Ethiopian Bible was quietly sealed, when Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity in the 4th century. The faith entered an entirely new phase. What had once been decentralized, diverse, and often debated now needed uniformity. An empire cannot afford competing doctrines. It requires a single story, a single authority, and a single theological framework capable of stabilizing millions of people across vast territories. That is why councils like the Council of Nicaea were convened not merely to seek truth, but to enforce cohesion. Doctrine was debated, voted on, and codified. And while not every book of the Bible was finalized at once, the direction was set. Christianity would now move towards standardization. Ethiopia was not part of this imperial project. Geographically distant and politically independent, Ethiopia had already developed a Christian identity rooted in earlier Jewish Christian traditions. Its theology emphasized continuity with ancient Israel, angelology, cosmic order, and divine justice beyond human institutions. Rome emphasized hierarchy. Ethiopia emphasized holiness. That difference mattered. As the Western Church grew in influence, eventually forming what we now call the Roman Catholic Church, its authority extended beyond belief into education, translation, and historical record. What Rome preserved became orthodox. What it rejected slowly faded from public awareness. And this is where the Ethiopian Bible encountered a new threat, not direct condemnation, but historical invisibility. European scholars writing church history rarely consulted African sources. Seminaries trained clergy using Latin and Greek texts only. Anything outside that framework was treated as peripheral. Africa, despite being central to early Christianity, was reclassified as a receiver, not a contributor. This erasure intensified during the age of European expansion. As colonial power spread across Africa, they brought missionaries with them, armed not only with Bibles, but with assumptions. The Bible they carried was considered complete, final, and superior. Local Christian traditions were seen as incomplete echoes of European theology. But Ethiopia disrupted that narrative. Ethiopia was already Christian before many European nations. It had bishops, monasteries, scripture, and liturgy centuries earlier. More importantly, it had a different Bible, one that predated many Western translations. That posed a problem, because colonial theology depends on hierarchy. The colonizer teaches, the colonized receives. Ethiopia reversed that relationship. It exposed the idea that Christianity did not belong to Europe alone. So the Ethiopian canon was dismissed, not debated. Western theologians labeled it expanded, regional, or non-standard. These labels sound neutral, but they carry an assumption that there exists a single default Bible, and everything else is deviation. But default according to whom? History shows that canon formation was never neutral. It followed lines of power. Books that supported institutional authority survived. Books that complicated hierarchy, introduced cosmic rebellion, or empowered individual revelation were easier to remove. This is why texts emphasizing angels, visions, and divine judgment outside church structures disappeared first. They could not be controlled. Ethiopia preserved those texts precisely because it was never fully absorbed into Western ecclesiastical power. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church aimed apostolic succession, independent of Rome, resisting theological domination even when surrounded by Islamic expansion and later European pressure. But resistance has consequences. By the 19th and 20th centuries, biblical scholarship was dominated by European universities. Their frameworks defined authentic Christianity. Their translations shaped global faith. Their footnotes decided which books were ancient and which were dismissed. Ethiopia was rarely invited into the conversation. Even when Western scholars acknowledged the existence of Ethiopian texts, they were often treated as curiosities valuable for linguistic study, but irrelevant for doctrine. That distinction matters, because when scholarship refuses to take a tradition seriously, it effectively silences it. Yet the irony is striking. Some of the very texts dismissed as Ethiopian editions were later confirmed to be ancient through archaeological discoveries. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed that books like Enoch and Jubilees were widely read in Jewish communities long before Christianity emerged. This means the Ethiopian Bible did not add these texts. It kept them, and keeping them preserved. A version of Christianity that remembers something Western. Christianity chose to forget that early faith was diverse, mystical, and deeply connected to the unseen world. So why didn't this discovery change everything? Because by the time evidence surfaced, power had already spoken. Canon had been closed. Institutions had formed. Theological systems had hardened. Reopening scripture would destabilize centuries of doctrine, authority, and identity. And institutions rarely reopen foundations. They built their power on. So instead of restoring the Ethiopian canon to equal status, Western theology reclassified it as interesting but irrelevant, not wrong, just ignorable. That is the most effective form of banning. No fire, no decree, no persecution. Just silence. But silence does not erase truth. It delays it. And today, as global Christianity shifts southward back toward Africa, the Ethiopian Bible is no longer so easy to ignore. It stands as evidence that Christianity was never meant to be owned by one culture, one empire, or one canon. In the next section, we will confront the most controversial question of all. What theological ideas in the Ethiopian Bible directly conflict with mainstream Christian doctrine today, and why that conflict still matters? Because once you understand those differences, you'll realize this is not ancient history. It is a living debate. If politics determined which books survived, theology determined which ideas were considered dangerous, because the Ethiopian Bible does more than add extra chapters to familiar stories. It presents a different theological atmosphere, one that clashes sharply with how Christianity later evolved in the West. And this is where things become uncomfortable. Western Christianity eventually settled into a structured system: original sin, salvation through Christ, church-mediated authority, heaven and hell framed in relatively simple terms. But the Ethiopian canon preserves older theological layers, ideas that complicate, expand, and sometimes disrupt that system entirely. One of the most destabilizing differences is the Ethiopian Bible's expanded cosmic worldview. In many Ethiopian texts, especially those preserved through the Book of Enoch, evil is not primarily human. It is angelic. Sign does not begin in Eden alone. It begins in heaven. According to Enoch, divine beings known as the Watchers rebel against God, descend to earth, corrupt humanity, and introduce forbidden knowledge, warfare, sorcery, exploitation, and domination. Humanity becomes corrupted not simply by choice, but by exposure. This reframes moral failure. In Western theology, humanity bears almost total responsibility for sin. In the Ethiopian worldview, humanity is victimized by cosmic rebellion. Judgment is not merely about moral guilt, it is about restoration of divine order. That distinction matters, because if evil originates partly outside humanity, then salvation is not just forgiveness, it is cosmic healing. And that challenges simplified atonement models developed centuries later. Another theological tension lies in how revelation operates. Western Christianity gradually centralized revelation. God speaks through Scripture, but Scripture is interpreted by councils, creeds, and clerical authority. Over time, this structure stabilized belief, but also narrowed spiritual imagination. The Ethiopian Bible preserves a more open revelatory framework. Visions, dreams, angelic encounters, prophetic insight, these are not relics of the past. They remain active modes of divine communication. Authority flows downward from God, not upward from institutions. That is dangerous to any centralized church, because if God can speak outside official channels, then no institution can fully control truth. This is one reason mystical and apocalyptic texts were gradually removed or marginalized in Western Christianity. They inspire, but they also inspire independence. Another point of conflict involves time and judgment. Western Christianity often emphasizes a linear timeline: creation, fall, redemption, final judgment. Ethiopian texts emphasize cycles, ages, and divine calendars. Books like Jubilees structure history according to heavenly order, not political chronology. This creates a theology where God's timing supersedes human systems. Empires rise and fall, but divine order remains unchanged. That message does not flatter earthly power. And then there is the issue of law and continuity. Western Christianity increasingly defined itself in contrast to Judaism. The Old Covenant was seen as fulfilled and superseded. Ethiopian theology resisted that sharp break. The Ethiopian Bible emphasizes continuity between Israel and the Church. Law is not abolished, it is transformed. Sabbath, covenant, and obedience retain spiritual significance. This challenges replacement theology, the idea that the Church fully replaced Israel, and replacement theology supported empire. because it allowed Christianity to redefine itself as universal while dismissing its Jewish roots. Ethiopian Christianity never accepted that severance, which brings us to the most controversial issue of all, authority itself. In Western Christianity, authority gradually consolidated into structures: the papacy, councils, confessions, denominations. Truth flowed from institution to believer. In Ethiopian theology, authority flows from holiness, not hierarchy. Saints matter, monks matter, righteous individuals matter. Scripture is preserved through lived faith, not enforced uniformity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church developed a spirituality centered on asceticism, prayer, fasting, and continuity, not doctrinal innovation. That made it resistant to reform, but also resistant to manipulation. From the Western perspective, this theology appeared messy, mystical, and uncontrolled. From the Ethiopian perspective, Western theology appeared rigid, political, and overconfident. These two visions could not easily coexist. So instead of engaging Ethiopian theology seriously, Western Christianity minimized it, not because it was incoherent, but because it was too coherent in a different way. It preserved a Christianity that remembered angels, cosmic order, divine mystery, and human limitation, a Christianity less suited for empire. And here is the key realization. The Ethiopian Bible does not contradict Christianity, but it complicates it. It reminds us that early Christianity was not a single stream, but a river with many currents, some of which were later dammed, redirected, or forgotten. The Western Church chose clarity over mystery, structure over plurality, authority over openness. Ethiopia chose memory. The choice made its Bible suspicious, and suspicion leads to exclusion. But exclusion does not erase influence. Many ideas once dismissed as extra-biblical have quietly returned through modern theology. Spiritual warfare, cosmic redemption, divine counsel language, often without acknowledging their Ethiopian roots, which raises a final, unsettling question. What else did we inherit without knowing where it came from? In the next section, we will explore how modern scholarship, archaeology, and rediscovered manuscripts are forcing a re-evaluation of the Ethiopian Bible and why the old reasons for dismissing it no longer hold. Because history has a way of resurfacing what power tried to bury, and when it does, it demands to be reckoned with. 4 centuries, dismissing the Ethiopian Bible was easy. It was distant, it was untranslated, and it existed outside Western academic control. But history has a habit of overturning comfortable assumptions. Beginning in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, something unexpected happened. Archaeology began to speak, and what it revealed quietly undermined many of the reasons the Ethiopian Bible had been sidelined in the first place. The most decisive moment came with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves near Qumran and untouched for nearly 2,000 years. These manuscripts shattered long-held assumptions about Jewish and early Christian scripture. Among them were fragments of texts long dismissed by Western Christianity, texts preserved most fully not in Europe, but in Ethiopia. Suddenly, books like the Book of Enoch and Jubilees were no longer theoretical reconstructions. They were ancient, physical documents older than many biblical manuscripts used in modern translations. This discovery forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable reality. These books were not late inventions. They were not fringe fantasies. They were part of the scriptural ecosystem of Second Temple Judaism, the very world Jesus and the apostles lived in, which meant the Ethiopian church had not been preserving extra scripture. It had been preserving early scripture. This realization did not immediately transform theology. Institutions move slowly, especially when foundations are at stake, but cracks began to appear. Scholars started acknowledging that early Judaism and, by extension, early Christianity was far more diverse than previously admitted. Angelology, apocalyptic expectation, divine counsels, and cosmic conflict were not marginal ideas. They were mainstream. In other words, the theological world preserved in the Ethiopian Bible looked less like an aberration and more like a snapshot of early faith before later simplification. This created a dilemma. If these texts were ancient and influential, why were they excluded? The old explanations no longer worked. It was no longer credible to claim they were unreliable, nor could they be dismissed as late theological speculation. The question now was not historical, but institutional. Once a canon is closed, reopening it threatens authority, and authority is rarely surrendered voluntarily. So instead of reintegrating these books, Western scholarship created a compromise. The texts were studied but not preached, analyzed but not canonized, treated as background literature rather than scripture. This distinction preserved institutional stability while acknowledging historical reality, but it also revealed the truth. Canon is not determined solely by antiquity or authenticity. It is determined by acceptability, and acceptability is shaped by theology, politics, and tradition. The Ethiopian Bible challenges this framework by refusing to separate scripture from lived faith. In the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, these texts were never theoretical. They were read, sung, and taught as sacred for centuries, which raises another critical issue. Western Christianity often assumes that academic validation precedes spiritual legitimacy. Ethiopia reverses that logic. For Ethiopians, scripture is validated by continuity, holiness, and communal preservation, not university endorsement. This difference explains why rediscovery did not lead to reconciliation. Western institutions could accept the existence of Ethiopian texts, but not their authority. Because authority changes everything. If the Ethiopian canon is legitimate, then Christianity never had a single universal Bible. It had multiple canons shaped by geography, tradition, and theology, and that realization destabilizes claims of exclusivity. It also recenters Africa. For centuries, Christian history has been narrated from north to south, from Jerusalem to Rome to Europe to the rest of the world. Ethiopia disrupts that line. It represents a parallel stream of Christianity that did not flow through Rome. That matters deeply in a post-colonial world, because theology has consequences. If Africa preserved ancient scripture faithfully, while Europe edited and standardized it for empire, then the assumption of Western theological superiority collapses, and that collapse is uncomfortable, which is why many modern Christians encounter the Ethiopian Bible today not through churches, but through the internet, through documentaries, through whispered conversations and viral clips asking, "Why didn't we learn this?" That question itself signals a shift. Information is no longer gatekept by institutions alone. Ancient texts are accessible, translations circulate, and curiosity grows where silence once prevailed. But curiosity leads to pressure. And pressure forces institutions to respond. Some theologians now acknowledge that books like Enoch influenced New Testament thought. Others admit that early Christianity was far more mystical and apocalyptic than modern doctrine suggests. A few even argue that canon should be understood as tradition-specific, not universal. These admissions would have been unthinkable a century ago. Yet notice what has not happened. No major Western denomination has expanded its canon. No Bible publisher has restored these books to Scripture. No council has reopened the question officially. The walls are cracking, but they have not fallen. Why? Because admitting historical complexity is one thing, restructuring faith is another. And restructuring faith threatens identity. The Ethiopian Bible forces Christianity to confront its plural origins. It refuses the idea that truth must be uniform to be authentic. It insists that faith can be ancient, consistent, and legitimate even if it does not align with Western norms. That insistence is its power and its danger, because once believers realize that Scripture was shaped by history, not handed down as a finalized package, new questions emerge. Questions about authority, questions about interpretation, questions about what else might have been lost or deliberately left behind. In the next section, we will explore how the Ethiopian Bible survived centuries of pressure without reforming, fragmenting, or disappearing, and what that survival reveals about faith, resistance, and identity. Because survival is not accidental. It is a choice, and Ethiopia made that choice long before the world was ready to understand it. By all historical logic, the Ethiopian Bible should not exist. Empires collapsed around it. Religions rose and fell beside it. Colonial powers attempted to overwrite it. And yet, it remains, not fragmented, not revised, not absorbed. To understand why, we must stop thinking of the Ethiopian Bible as a book and begin seeing it as a living system. In Western Christianity, Scripture survived primarily through institutions, universities, councils, printing presses, and later publishing houses. Authority flowed through hierarchy. Preservation depended on policy. In Ethiopia, preservation flowed through life itself. The Ethiopian Bible survived because it was woven into daily existence, into fasting calendars, prayer cycles, monastic discipline, oral transmission, and national identity. It was not something you occasionally read. It was something you inhabited. At the center of this preservation stood the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, whose structure differed radically from Western models. There was no pope, no centralized doctrinal authority issuing revisions. Instead, continuity was guarded through tradition, repetition, and deep reverence for the past. Change was not progress. Change was danger. This mindset alone explains much of Ethiopia's resilience. While Western Christianity repeatedly revised translations to fit linguistic, political, or doctrinal shifts, Ethiopian Christianity treated Scripture as sacred in its received form. The ancient language of Ge'ez was preserved precisely because it resisted casual reinterpretation. This was not ignorance. It was strategy. A fixed sacred language acts like a vault. Meaning can be studied, but not easily altered. Doctrine can be taught, but not casually reshaped. That vault protected books others lost. Another reason for survival lies in monastic culture. Ethiopia developed one of the most enduring monastic traditions in Christian history. Monks did not simply pray, they copied manuscripts by hand, memorized scripture, and guarded texts as acts of devotion. In many monasteries, Scripture was not owned by individuals. It belonged to the community, the ancestors, and the faith itself. This collective ownership prevented fragmentation and privatization. When books are owned by institutions, they can be revised. When books are owned by communities, they are defended, even during times of invasion and instability. Ethiopian monks hid manuscripts, relocated libraries, and passed knowledge orally when written preservation was threatened. This is how texts survive when paper burns. Then there is Ethiopia's unique historical position. Ethiopia was never fully colonized in the same way much of Africa was. While it faced pressure, conflict, and attempted domination, it retained sovereignty long enough to protect its religious institutions. This mattered. Colonial Christianity often replaced local traditions with European theology, presenting itself as more advanced or pure. Ethiopia was one of the few places where that narrative failed. Missionaries arrived carrying Western Bibles only to discover that Ethiopia already had one, and not a simplified one, a larger one. An older one. And that realization forced an awkward silence, because it is difficult to erase a tradition that predates yours. Another overlooked factor is integration of Scripture with identity. In Ethiopia, Christianity is not merely belief, it is heritage. Scripture is tied to national history, kingship narratives, and collective memory. The Bible is not something imported, it is something inherited. This made removal impossible. To remove books from the Ethiopian Bible would not simply be a theological decision, it would be an act of cultural violence, severing people from their ancestors and identity. Western Christianity often treats doctrine as adjustable. Ethiopian Christianity treats it as ancestral trust. That difference cannot be overstated. And then there is resistance, not loud, confrontational resistance, but quiet refusal. Ethiopia did not campaign to force its canon onto the world. It did not seek validation from Rome or Protestant Europe. It simply continued reading what it had always read. This refusal to argue paradoxically preserved integrity. When institutions debate canon, politics enter the room. Ethiopia avoided that room entirely. Silence became shield, but survival came at a cost, because what Ethiopia preserved, the world ignored. For centuries, Ethiopian Christianity was framed as exotic, mystical, or archaic. Its texts were studied selectively. Its theology was rarely allowed to influence mainstream doctrine. Yet that marginalization protected authenticity, because once a tradition becomes mainstream, it becomes vulnerable to revision. Ethiopia remained peripheral and thus intact. But today, that isolation is ending. Digital access, global scholarship, and growing interest in early Christianity bringing Ethiopian texts into public awareness, and with awareness comes scrutiny. People are asking new questions. Why were these books preserved here and not elsewhere? What does it mean that they survived unchanged? What does that say about how Christianity evolved globally? These questions are not academic. They are destabilizing, because if the Ethiopian Bible survived precisely because it resisted institutional consolidation, then perhaps survival and authority are not the same thing. Perhaps truth does not always travel through power. Perhaps sometimes it survives through humility, patience, and refusal to conform. And that idea unsettles modern Christianity. In the next section, we will explore how contemporary believers are reacting to the Ethiopian Bible today, why some feel drawn to it, why others feel threatened by it, and why its re-emergence is happening now, not centuries ago. Because survival is only the first chapter. The real question is what happens when what survived begins to speak again. The Ethiopian Bible did not suddenly become important. It was always important. What changed is who is listening. For centuries, access to Scripture was controlled by institutions, churches, seminaries, publishers, and scholars. What believers read was filtered through authority. What they questioned was limited by tradition, and what they were never shown, they rarely knew existed. That era is ending. Today, ancient texts travel freely. Manuscripts once locked in monasteries are digitized. Scholarly debates once hidden behind paywalls appear in public forums. And believers across the world are encountering ideas that feel at once ancient and unfamiliar. The Ethiopian Bible is resurfacing because the gatekeepers are losing control, and that shift is deeply unsettling to established theology. Many modern Christians first encounter the Ethiopian canon through a sense of dissonance. They read about books like the Book of Enoch, discover that it was quoted in the New Testament, and ask a simple question: why wasn't this included? That question is powerful because it bypasses doctrine and goes straight to trust. Once believers realize that Scripture was shaped by historical decisions, councils, and politics, faith no longer feels as fixed as they were taught. And for some, that realization feels like betrayal. For others, it feels like liberation. This is why reactions to the Ethiopian Bible today are so polarized. Some believers feel drawn to it because it restores mystery. It speaks of angels, cosmic conflict, divine order, and judgment in ways that feel larger than modern, streamlined theology. It offers a worldview where faith is not just moral instruction, but participation in a cosmic story. In an age of disillusionment, that depth feels refreshing. Others feel threatened, because if the Ethiopian Bible is legitimate, then the version of Christianity they inherited may not be complete, and incompleteness raises difficult questions about authority, interpretation, and certainty. Modern Christianity, especially in the West, often values clarity, consistency, and predictability. The Ethiopian canon introduces ambiguity, complexity, and plurality. It asks believers to sit with Uncertainty. And many are uncomfortable doing that. Another reason for this resurgence is global Christianity itself. Christianity's center of gravity is shifting southward toward Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia as Western influence declines. Non-Western Christian traditions are no longer content to remain footnotes. Africa is reclaiming its role in Christian history. And Ethiopia stands at the center of that reclamation. For too long, African Christianity was framed as derivative introduced by European missionaries. The Ethiopian Bible shatters that narrative. It proves that Africa did not merely receive Christianity, it preserved it sometimes more faithfully than the institutions that later claimed ownership. That realization changes conversations about theology, history, and authority. It also challenges racialized assumptions about whose Christianity counts. The resurgence is also fueled by spiritual dissatisfaction. Many believers feel that modern Christianity has become overly institutionalized, politicized, or commercialized. They crave depth, discipline, and transcendence. Ethiopian Christianity, with its fasting cycles, ancient liturgy, and uncompromising continuity, offers an alternative, not a replacement. A reminder. It reminds believers that Christianity once demanded patience, sacrifice, and reverence, not instant answers and motivational slogans, and Scripture reflected that seriousness. The Ethiopian Bible does not offer easy theology. It does not simplify evil. It does not flatten the spiritual world. It insists that reality is layered, mysterious, and sometimes terrifying for seekers tired of reductionism. That honesty is compelling, but resurgence also brings misunderstanding. Some online narratives exaggerate claims, framing the Ethiopian Bible as a forbidden book that will overturn Christianity overnight. That framing attracts attention, but it also distorts reality. The Ethiopian Bible does not destroy Christianity. It contextualizes it. It reminds us that Christianity did not emerge fully formed. It grew, debated, disagreed, and evolved. Different communities preserved different streams of that growth. Ethiopia preserved one of the oldest streams, recognizing that does not invalidate other traditions, but it does challenge exclusivity, and exclusivity is the real issue. Institutions fear the Ethiopian Bible not because it is false, but because it multiplies perspectives. It refuses the idea that faith must be uniform to be authentic. That refusal destabilizes centralized authority, which is why many official responses to the Ethiopian canon remain cautious. It is acknowledged academically, but rarely embraced spiritually, studied, but not integrated. Yet believers are integrating it anyway, quietly, individually, outside institutions. That pattern mirrors how early Christianity spread in the first place. Grassroots curiosity, shared texts, uncomfortable questions. History is repeating itself, but this time the questions are not about Christ's divinity or doctrine alone. They are about who controls sacred memory. Who decides what counts as scripture? Who gets to define orthodoxy? And why were some voices amplified while others were silenced? The Ethiopian Bible does not answer all these questions, but it forces them into the open. And once questions are asked, they cannot be unasked. In the next section, we will confront the most difficult tension of all: what embracing the Ethiopian Bible would actually mean for modern Christianity, and whether unity can survive plurality, because rediscovery is only the beginning. The real challenge comes when believers must decide what to do with what they found. At this point, the question is no longer historical. It is existential, because once believers accept that the Ethiopian Bible is ancient, coherent, and legitimate within its own tradition, a far more unsettling issue emerges. What does this mean for Christianity as a whole? For centuries, Christianity has presented itself as unified around a single sacred text. Differences existed in interpretation, denomination, and ritual, but the Bible itself was treated as fixed. The assumption was simple: one faith, one canon. The Ethiopian Bible disrupts that assumption. Not by attacking it, but by existing alongside it. This is why the Ethiopian canon makes many Christians uneasy. It introduces plurality where certainty once lived. It suggests that Christianity may have developed with multiple authorized scriptural traditions, not one universally enforced standard. And that idea feels dangerous, because unity has long been Christianity's shield. Unity allowed the Church to survive persecution, resist heresy, and expand across cultures. Unity made doctrine teachable and faith transmissible. Unity gave believers confidence that they were standing on settled ground. Plurality threatens that stability. If Christianity can have more than one canon, then belief becomes contextual, faith becomes historical, authority becomes shared rather than centralized. And that raises fears of fragmentation. Many critics of the Ethiopian Bible worrying about exactly this. They ask whether embracing multiple canons would lead to doctrinal chaos, different theologies, competing interpretations, and the loss of shared foundation. But history tells a more complex story. Early Christianity already lived with plurality. Before canon was standardized, different Christian communities read different collections of texts. Some emphasized apocalyptic writings, others focused on wisdom literature, some preserved angelic traditions, others emphasized moral instruction. Unity did not come from identical books. It came from shared devotion to Christ. Canonization happened later not to create faith, but to regulate it. And regulation, while useful, always comes at a cost. The Ethiopian Bible exposes that cost. It shows that in choosing unity through standardization, Christianity also chose exclusion. Certain voices were elevated, others were quieted, not always because they were wrong but because they did not fit emerging institutional needs. That does not mean standard canons are illegitimate. It means they are partial. This is where the real tension lies. Modern Christianity often treats canon as synonymous with truth, but the Ethiopian tradition treats canon as synonymous with faithfulness to what was received, preserved, and lived. Those are not the same thing. Truth asks, is this correct? Faithfulness asks, did we guard what we were given? Ethiopia answers the second question with confidence. The Western Church answers the first with authority. Both answers matter. The problem arises when one answer is used to erase the other. Embracing the Ethiopian Bible does not require every Christian to adopt its full canon, but it does require acknowledging that Christianity's history is broader than one narrative and that Scripture itself has been shaped by geography, power, and tradition. That acknowledgement alone is transformative. It changes how believers read the Bible they already have. Suddenly, silence becomes meaningful, absence becomes intentional, what is not said becomes as important as what is. This is why some believers experience a crisis when encountering the Ethiopian canon. Not because their faith collapses but because it deepens. They realize that faith is not about memorizing a closed list of books. It is about engaging a living tradition that wrestled with God, angels, suffering, empire, and hope across centuries. That realization demands humility. And humility is hard for institutions. Institutions prefer certainty. They require boundaries. They depend on agreed limits to function. Multiple canons complicate governance, education, and doctrine, which is why official Christianity is unlikely to formally embrace the Ethiopian canon anytime soon, but formal embrace may not be necessary, because Christianity has always evolved from the ground up as much as from the top down. Believers shape faith through practice, through prayer, through questions, through what they choose to read, teach, and pass on. And right now, many believers are choosing to engage Ethiopian texts not as replacements, but as windows into early faith. They are reading them devotionally, studying them historically, letting them challenge assumptions rather than dictate doctrine. That approach does not fracture Christianity. It enriches it. The fear of plurality assumes that believers cannot hold complexity without collapsing into confusion. But history suggests the opposite. Faith matures through tension, not avoidance. The Ethiopian Bible forces Christianity to confront its own adolescent struggles, disagreements, and growing pains. It reminds believers that faith was once debated passionately, not packaged neatly. And perhaps that is exactly what modern Christianity needs. Not a new canon, but a deeper memory. A memory that faith did not begin with printed Bibles and footnotes. It began with stories told, visions seen, prayers whispered, and texts guarded by communities who believed their survival mattered. Ethiopia was one of those communities, and its Bible stands as evidence that Christianity did not travel a single road. It traveled many, some paved by empire, others by isolation, devotion, and resistance. So can Christianity survive more than one Bible? It already has. What remains is whether modern believers are willing to admit it. In the next section, we will move toward resolution, examining what the Ethiopian Bible ultimately reveals about truth, authority, and the future of Christian faith, and why this ancient canon may be less a threat and more a mirror. Because sometimes what unsettles us is not new information. It is forgotten truth, finally remembered. By now, it should be clear that the Ethiopian Bible is not just an ancient artifact. It is a mirror held up to Christianity itself, reflecting uncomfortable questions about truth, authority, and how faith decides what is allowed to endure. Because beneath all debates about canon, councils, and manuscripts lies a deeper issue: who gets to define truth in a living religion? For much of Christian history, truth has been treated as something fixed, guarded, and enforced. Once doctrine was established, deviation became danger. Once canon was closed, alternatives became threats. This approach brought stability, but it also brought fragility, because when truth depends entirely on authority, authority becomes brittle. Any challenge, historical, textual, or cultural, feels like an attack. The Ethiopian Bible challenges authority not by arguing, but by existing faithfully outside it. It reveals that truth can survive without approval. That revelation is unsettling. Western Christianity often assumes that preservation equals correctness. If a text survived in the canon, it must be true. If it did not, it must be inferior. But Ethiopia exposes the flaw in that logic. Survival is not always about truth. Sometimes it is about power. Sometimes it is about who controls translation, education, and dissemination. Sometimes it is about which communities are considered authoritative enough to be remembered. Ethiopia was not powerless, but it was marginalized, and marginalization reshapes history. The Ethiopian Bible reveals that Christianity's memory is selective, not maliciously selective, but structurally selective. Traditions aligned with power were amplified. Traditions outside that power were preserved quietly or forgotten. This does not mean Western Christianity lied. It means it told one version of a larger story, and that distinction matters, because when believers realize that faith history is layered rather than linear, truth becomes something to be pursued humbly, not declared absolutely. Authority becomes something to steward, not monopolize. The Ethiopian tradition models this humility. It does not claim universal dominance. It does not demand replacement. It simply maintains continuity. Its authority flows from endurance centuries of prayer, fasting, preservation, and lived faith. That kind of authority cannot be manufactured. It must be earned through time. This is why the Ethiopian Bible carries weight even without global recognition. It has been tested by centuries of silence and pressure, and it did not bend. What does that say about truth? It suggests that truth may not always be loud. It may not always be institutional. It may survive in monasteries, oral traditions, marginalized communities, and sacred languages that refuse convenience. That idea reshapes how believers approach Scripture itself. Instead of asking, "Is this book officially recognized?" the question becomes, was this book trusted, lived, and guarded by faithful communities close to the origins of belief? That is a harder question, and a more honest one, The Ethiopian Bible also exposes a tension in Christianity struggles with certainty versus mystery. Modern faith often prioritizes certainty, clear answers, defined boundaries, predictable theology. Mystery is tolerated only if it can be controlled. The Ethiopian canon resists that impulse. It preserves mystery unapologetically. Angels, whose names are strange, judgments that feel cosmic rather than legal, timelines that stretch beyond human calculation. It does not explain everything, and it does not try to. That restraint feels threatening in a religious culture trained to systematize belief. But early Christianity was not systematic. It was experiential, apocalyptic, expectant. The Ethiopian Bible preserves that atmosphere, which raises another difficult realization, perhaps. What feels extra or too much today once felt normal. Perhaps modern Christianity did not inherit too little Scripture, but simplified it over time to make it governable. If that is true, then the Ethiopian Bible does not complicate faith. It restores its original scale, and scale changes everything. A small God fits neatly into institutions. A cosmic God does not. The Ethiopian Bible leans toward the cosmic. It insists that human history is only part of a larger spiritual drama, that angels matter, that rebellion predates humanity, that judgment restores order, not merely punishes wrongdoing. These ideas challenge anthropocentric faith, the belief that everything revolves around human behavior and institutions. They remind believers that God is not primarily managing churches. He is governing creation. That perspective humbles authority. And humility is not always welcome. This is why conversations about the Ethiopian Bible often trigger defensive reactions, not because believers are weak, but because identity feels threatened. Faith has been taught as stable, settled, and complete. The Ethiopian canon suggests faith was once open, debated, and dynamic. That realization can feel destabilizing, but it can also be freeing. Because faith that survives questioning is stronger than faith that avoids it. The Ethiopian Bible invites Christianity to mature too, move beyond fragile certainty into resilient trust. Trust that God's truth is larger than any single canon. Trust that faith can hold plurality without collapse. This does not mean abandoning tradition. It means understanding it more honestly. Tradition becomes a conversation across centuries, not a verdict handed down once and for all. And the Ethiopian Bible speaks into that conversation with a quiet authority earned through time, not power. As we move into the final section, one question remains. What does all of this mean now? Not academically, not historically, but spiritually. What does the survival of the Ethiopian Bible demand of modern believers, churches, and traditions? In the final section, we will bring this journey to its conclusion, examining why the Ethiopian Bible was never meant to replace other scriptures, but to remind Christianity of what it once was, and what it could still become. Because the most dangerous thing about this Bible is not what it adds. It is what it reveals. The Ethiopian Bible was never trying to overthrow Christianity. That is the great misunderstanding. It was never meant to replace the Bibles most Christians read today. It was never preserved as a protest, a rebellion, or a theological weapon. Ethiopia did not guard its canon in secret, waiting for the right moment to shock the world. It simply remembered, and memory, when it survives long enough, becomes disruptive. The Ethiopian Bible reminds Christianity of something modern faith often forgets, that belief did not begin with certainty. It began with encounter, with fear, with awe, with mystery, with people trying to understand a God far larger than their language, institutions, or doctrines could contain. Early Christianity was not neat. It was apocalyptic. It was mystical. It was contested. And it lived comfortably with questions modern Christianity often avoids. The Ethiopian tradition preserved that discomfort. It did not rush to resolve every tension. It did not trim scripture to make theology manageable. It allowed complexity to remain, trusting that God was not threatened by mystery. That trust is the real legacy of the Ethiopian Bible. When people ask why the Ethiopian Bible was banned, the most honest answer is this: it wasn't banned because it was false. It was marginalized because it refused simplification. It refused to shrink God. It refused to reduce evil to human weakness alone. It refused to limit revelation to institutions. It refused to frame faith as fully settled. Those refusals made it inconvenient. And inconvenience is dangerous to systems built on control. The Western Church needed clarity to govern empires. It needed fixed texts to train clergy. It needed closed canons to protect unity. In that context, plurality was not a virtue, it was a threat. Ethiopia existed outside that necessity. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did not build global empires. It built monasteries. It did not export doctrine aggressively. It preserved devotion patiently. Its Bible reflects that pasture. It does not argue for itself. It does not explain why it includes what it includes. It simply exists, as it always has: read, prayed, fasted, and lived. That is why its re-emergence feels so powerful today. Modern Christianity is facing a crisis not of belief, but of trust. Institutions are questioned. Authority is scrutinized. Simplistic answers no longer satisfy people who live in a complex world. In that moment, the Ethiopian Bible does not arrive with solutions. It arrives with depth. It offers a Christianity that expects struggle, that anticipates cosmic conflict, that assumes faith is something you grow into, not something handed to you, complete. And that is deeply attractive to a generation disillusioned with packaged spirituality. But it is also deeply challenging. Because embracing the Ethiopian Bible even intellectually means letting go of the illusion that Christianity was ever static. It means accepting that scripture, tradition, and theology were shaped by history, culture, and power. That acceptance does not weaken faith. It matures it. Faith becomes less about defending boundaries and more about seeking truth with humility. Less about certainty and more about faithfulness. The Ethiopian Bible teaches that faithfulness sometimes looks like preservation, not innovation. Like holding on to what others discard. Like trusting ancestors who guarded texts without knowing whether the world would ever care again. And now the world does care, but care comes with responsibility. The Ethiopian Bible should not be sensationalized. It should not be weaponized against other Christian traditions. It should not be reduced to viral soundbites about hidden books and forbidden truths. That would betray its spirit. Its purpose is not to shock. It is to witness. It witnesses to a Christianity that remembered angels when others forgot them, that remembered cosmic order when others narrowed focus, that remembered continuity when others chose rupture. It witnesses to the idea that truth does not need to be loud to endure. And perhaps that is its greatest gift. In a time when religion is often used to dominate, divide, or simplify, the Ethiopian Bible stands as quiet proof that faith can survive without conquering, that scripture can endure without being standardized by force. It tells us that Christianity's story is bigger than we were taught and that bigness is not a problem to solve, but a reality to honor. So what do we do with this knowledge? Not everyone needs to read all 81 books. Not every church needs to change its canon. Not every believer needs to reconstruct their theology overnight. But every believer can do one thing. Listen to the parts of Christian history that were not centered. Listen to traditions that survived without approval. Listen to the possibility that God has always been at work beyond our boundaries. The Ethiopian Bible does not demand agreement. It demands humility. And humility is where faith grows best, because in the end, this Bible was never meant to replace what you believe. It was meant to remind you of something essential. That Christianity did not begin fully formed, that truth is bigger than any single tradition, and that sometimes what was pushed to the margins was never lost. It was waiting for a time when faith would be strong enough to remember. The story of the Ethiopian Bible is not just about ancient manuscripts or missing books, it is about memory, power, and faith. It reminds us that Christianity did not grow in a straight line, and truth was never confined to one empire, one council, or one canon. While some traditions standardized scripture, Ethiopia chose preservation, while others simplified faith. Ethiopia guarded its depth, and in doing so, it carried forward a version of Christianity that still unsettles, challenges, and inspires today. This Bible was not silenced because it lacked truth, but because it carried too much of it. And now, centuries later, that truth is resurfacing, asking us to rethink what we were taught. And why not, if this story expanded your understanding? Like this video, subscribe for more deep historical revelations, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and drop a comment below what surprised you most about the Ethiopian Bible.